directionality of what you know. And if you study applied ethics, and I love that you talked about studying religion, etc., you learn pretty quickly that non-Western ethical traditions or indigenous traditions are not only interesting to know in terms of sales. I used to work at Porter Novelli. I was an EVP of that PR firm, part of Omnicom for years. But you learn that foundationally it's what AI, because I have deep expertise in artificial intelligence and ethics, it's the basis for how the systems actually work. And again, as continued momentary filler, because I don't want to get too philosophical or geeky from the get-go. But put simply, in the West, binary code 1-0. That's what's called dualism, if you get into my biz of applied philosophy. And dualism in terms of consciousness also often means people think all of who you are is what's up here, your intelligence. And that's in general a Western framing. Whereas what I learned in my work with IEEE, which again I'll tell you more about in a minute, in 2016, we released this big report. In 2016, it was 100 experts in AI, but they were all from the West, UK, Canada, and the States. And we got feedback from Mexico and Japan and China. And all these people said, this is great, but this is only Western. And at the time I was like, what does that actually mean, right? I knew it empirically. But now I'll go back to, again, that young woman who reported and said, you know, I don't see myself, and doctor, if this is what they meant, I don't see myself in your research, it's cis white men. So I'll give the example, and I'll wrap this up quickly, but I think the questions most people in modernity don't get asked, especially kids now in digital times, and I've been in this space, my first book came out in 2009 about transparency, but I don't think most people are asked, what are you worth? And not just your fiscal worth, but what are you worth? And how do you know? And if you aren't asked those questions, then you kind of go through life waiting for stuff. And then finally I'll say, Descartes, I did a TED Talk in 2013 where I did a pun, which I always like sharing. Descartes said, I think, therefore I am, which is a very Western framing of consciousness. I said it back in 2013, it's actually I think, therefore I am. We actually exist. Our identity is more digital and virtual these days than it is, you know, live. And in that sense, if you don't know what's called like Ubuntu ethics or non-Western ethics, there's this idea of I am because we are. And when you take the best of, as it were, Western thinking and apply what it means to be in community, visceral community, this is where you kind of get the best of both worlds. Anyway, thanks for my momentary filler as I welcome our guests who are now mic'd onto the stage. All right, so if you see me checking my phone, it is because that's where I have my notes. I'm not checking email, just to say ethics and disclosure. Anybody? Disclosure? I worked in PR. We made our living off of when people didn't do the stuff that you're building, but I don't work in PR anymore. And by the way, I'm joking because, of course, we wanted our clients to use the ethical foundational tools that you're building. And I'm really admiring that you're doing this, and I'm happy to try to support it. So before I talk for another 2 minutes, let's do this if everyone is open on the panel. I'm really excited for you to get to know Dana and Alana. And what I thought we could do is if you want to take maybe a minute or two each, a little bit longer even, and kind of explain your core philosophy that we talked about in our conversation, because I think that'll be a good grounding for everyone as we continue the conversation. So do you want to start first? Is that cool?
Sure.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Elena. I work for MasterCard, but like Ty, I am not here representing MasterCard, just myself and my experiences. So I've worked as a model developer and a data scientist for IBM. I've been in academia and in civil society, both in the US and in Europe as a researcher, and now work for MasterCard on operationalizing AI governance on the AI governance team. So that team at MasterCard sees every AI product that MasterCard builds or buys, and we make sure it's in alignment with our data and tech responsibility principles. So the real way, and sort of my core philosophy in focusing on AI governance, more than AI ethics almost even, is how do you make this real? How do you take something from a word on a page like fairness into a change in your product, into a change in your model that impacts a real person, that impacts the individual at the end of that pipeline? So how do you do this in a way that changes people's incentives, actually makes things easier, enables data science and development teams so that things are as easy as possible, where the goal is we want this to make a difference, we want things to be fair on the outset, so we need to do a lot of stuff downstream, in terms of enablement, process, automation, to make that really happen. So operationalizing things, really concretely grounding them in the way that the real world industry operates is really the core of my philosophy around AI governance and how we work at MasterCard.
Great, I love that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dana?
Hi, everyone. So my name is Dana LaFawn. I'm by training a behavioral scientist or a social scientist. Before I served the government, I worked as a forensic psychologist and adhering to the APA, the American Psychological Association guidance and ethical guidelines. Then I spent about 20 plus years, now I'm formally, officially with the government, working as an operational psychologist for the National Security Agency. An operational psychologist is someone who's in mission, who's looking at the adversaries and figuring out how we can mitigate the damage that they do to the country. And since then, I've also worked at the Council on Foreign Relations as a fellow, and my focus was in influence inoculation, which I'll speak a little bit about later in this panel. With regard to advertising ethics, I'm honored to be on the council for IAA. I love that position. It gives me some insight into what they're doing, and I feel very special to be able to provide that input. And I want to thank Andrew for today for arranging this, and to all of our sponsors today. So my focus for advertising ethics specifically is about bias. I study bias, and specifically implicit and explicit bias. So when we think about implicit bias, that is what's feeding on our cognitive systems that we're not aware of. Things like nudges, things like influence principles, things like cognitive biases that we're all familiar with, like confirmation bias. All of those things operate at a subliminal level that we are not familiar with. And my focus is on that. With regard to AI, there are multiple vectors into the AI process where bias is absolutely present. Implicit bias is absolutely present. It's present in the data that the AI is trained on. It's present in the algorithms that a human wrote. And it's present in the results. For example, I hear myself. This is the most important part. It's present in the results, through either hallucinations or ad hoc additions that may not be accurate or valid. There is bias throughout the entire process. And just in the inherent results given to a human being from AI, people tend to believe a computer is smarter than we are. That's a natural inclination. And it's specifically, that's the authority principle at work. It's an implicit bias that says we tend to believe those experts, those authority figures, so we tend to believe them. We give them the benefit of the doubt, if you will, at an unconscious level, and that's what's important here. And so when you get those results, you tend to believe them, which means you tend to not question them, which is my focus area in AI and ethics and advertising ethics.
Thank you very much. To do my background, I wrote this book. Thank you for the pitch, by the way, Tom. I owe you a coffee, which, again, thanks to our sponsors, it'll be coming from them anyway. But my book, Artificial Intelligence, Embracing Our Values to Maximize Machines in 2016, was what led me to our work, IEEE, which is the world's largest professional technology association founded by Thomas Edison. It's basically the heart of the global engineering community. And they invited me to speak at South by Southwest, where I'd already spoken a lot, and the free golden ticket, if anyone knows about Austin, you just go. And I was like, wait, if you're the world's biggest, you're engineers. And they're like, yeah, it's one of the E's. I was like, you should build a code of ethics for AI. Because I've been writing for The Guardian and other publications, and I thought stupidly I would just ask people hey, what's the code of ethics for AI? And either a marketer or an advertiser or a technician, a data scientist, someone would say, well, here it is. And back in 2011, I couldn't find one. And I thought, that seems like a thing. There should be one. So I went to IEEE and was lucky to work there, and we created this big document called Ethically Aligned Design. I'll share the link with you. It ended up being 400 pages after 3 different versions. And we'd gone to the OECD. It's kind of a fundamental part of the EU AI Act. It's used by hundreds of companies. But a couple of things just to build off of what Dana was saying. And having worked, and by the way, I speak for myself, not for all of IEEE. It's a big organization. A couple of things is to recognize Gen AI is one architecture of artificial intelligence. If we were at a car a car conference, and I was like, Ford, 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 Ford. And someone's like, aren't there other brands besides Ford? And I was like, Ford, right? Someone would be like, this other so architectures mean how you use the tool. So deep learning, et cetera. AI has been around for, since the 50s is when the term was introduced. So please be very clear that large language models and Gen AI as an architecture from a professional in the field, as a rule, and I'm going to validate a couple quick examples, they're largely erroneous. Me, John, I'm speaking. They are unethical, and I'll give you some examples. And also just, they're not making money. Like I used to work in Porter Novelli, my CFO, I'd have 30 seconds, I'd walk in, I'm like, even Satya Nadella says it's not making money except for some shareholders and the 3 guys running the 3 companies. And that's all I have time to do. But let me give you an example. ChatGPT says at the bottom, under the fold, after you use the tool for the first time, it says ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info. When you leave this room, if you go to the elevator and it says this elevator may make mistakes, check important info, you're not going to ride on it, right? But I used to work also as a journalist at the ASGA. I used to be a professional actor, the Screen Actors Guild, right? There are contracts that bind these things where ethics is grounded in law and disclosure. And also there's tools all over now. All of the big Gen AI companies have what's called anthropomorphism by design. And I learned about this back in the advertising day, Stanford economics into different trainings. And it's not about putting anyone down, and then we'll go to questions because I didn't want to take too long with my opening salvo, but is to recognize that I'm 56. When you're over a certain age and you go to a website and it says, hi, I'm Meta, or Claude as the name of Anthropic. Anthropomorphism is a natural human trait where people think something's alive. We think our teddy bears are alive. And at some point we grow out of that. That is not a taught societal global norm anymore. What that means is that however many, I think it's 1.5 billion users, it's too many, of ChatGPT, for instance, are being trained that the tools are sentient and alive. So on top of what you just said, Doctor, is just kind of a natural thing of like what you can do to build trust with brands, and why I'm so happy to work with Andrew about certifications, and that's going to be my next question, is to say where there's kind of any doubt about these tools, especially Gen AI. And the final thing I'll remind people is that we use the term AI systems. No AI runs except on human data. So the core of anything we do to build trust has to recognize that we're honoring how we use people's data. Okay, thanks for letting me do my other mini TED Talk right there. And I'll give some more examples where I'm not about decrying AI. I'm about really making sure people understand, especially from brands, Gen AI is an architecture that more likely than not will harm your reputation because of some other ongoing errors I'll tell you about later. It's okay to say that technology will improve. Not all technology improves in the same realm of architectural design. Okay, so in terms of certifications, to do kind of a pitch for IAE, but in the sense of I really admire why you're doing it. And in the standards world, we have what are called certifications. So IEEE created the Wi-Fi standard. It's why you're on your phone right now. The certification is a sort of B to the A, where if a company builds Wi-Fi, then the certification comes in and says, here's how you know technologically interoperability, and I liked your example from LinkedIn of the idea of a building architecture. This is why it's going to work. That's a lot of the same things you can do with ethical-oriented principles in AI. So the certifications is what I want to ask you both about now. That logic of certifications, how do you see that working with regards to the work that you're doing at MasterCard or in the government? We'll start with you, Dana.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I mentioned explicit bias a few moments ago. There are ways to mitigate that. And when you do education and awareness trainings, you are directly mitigating that explicit bias. Examples of explicit bias include deception, whataboutism, straw man arguments, false logic arguments. Those are explicit bias. Those are not working at that unconscious level, but consciously influencing your decision making. The way we mitigate that primarily is through fact checking and through education and awareness. And so the certification program falls squarely into that category of education. Without those, we are not mitigating that explicit bias. It doesn't mitigate implicit bias. We have other tools for that. But both are valuable and both are necessary.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm really glad, Dana, that you brought up a risk framing actually as a way to establish a set of standards. So globally, there's a number of different methodologies in terms of setting standards. Some are, many are risk-based, some are rights-based. This is a quibble in terms of actual policy. Are you trying to defend against risks of AI systems, or are you trying to make sure that people individually have rights when they are interacting with those systems? Some combination of both, I think, is very helpful. But taking a risk-based approach to standards allows you to say, what are the emergent risks of this technology? Where do they come out? How do I identify where those risks are present, and then mitigate those? So at MasterCard, we have an approach of risk assessment, control verification, and then monitoring. So first, what are the risks of this technology? And as John mentioned, AI has been around and in production for many years, for decades. You know, most large companies have been using predictive AI systems for business optimization, for marketing and advertising likely for probably 20 years. And there are risks of that technology that can be mitigated through good data science, good data management, good data governance, once you identify them. And with generative AI technology, there is a new set of emergent risks that are not wholly different from those of predictive AI technology, but are a little bit more wide-ranging and depend on the architecture of Gen AI using fundamentally either text or image, usually generation or description. So taking a risk-based approach, I think, is a great way to set those standards and say, where are the risks here? How are we addressing these on a line item level? To be able to get an output that can be trusted and mitigated from risk.
Wonderful. I'll make a comment, then I'll go to what is my last question, because I want to make sure we get these thoughts if we have time for questions. So one thing about ethics, and again, I'm speaking as John, but I'm an author. I've written 3 books. I worked really hard on those books. And I believe, I will say this on the mic, it was unethical for Anthropic and Meta to use my books and scrape the data from my books without paying or even recognizing that. I'm used to citation. And Anthropic right now is facing a $1.5 billion lawsuit. And I was saying to Tom, I think this is a canary in the coal mine for the advertising industry. When all of a sudden you just wake up one day and you're like, wait a second, I went to Wiley and then Penguin twice and went through a lot of contracts. Money was involved, things about my intellectual property. I worked really hard. I interviewed hundreds of people. And someone just did, and now this is fair use. And those words are really hard as an artist or a writer, But I bring this up because please don't think that just because I'm an author or a Screen Actors Guild actor, that those industries make me unique. Data is the source of any AI system. Protecting your intellectual property and your client's intellectual property, using the right tools, the right systems, is of paramount and seminal importance. The precedents that are being set around intellectual property are not just about the artist community, right? I'm so tired of I prefer ChatGPT over this human artist. That is your subjective right. The legal side of it is a different answer, and contracts are a big deal. So I'm going to mention an IEEE thing in a second for my closing comment. But just so I don't miss, and if we have time, we'll keep going. But I really wanted to ask, because we had such a good conversation, what is the one thing that nobody ever asks you about Gen AI that you really wish people would say or ask you? And then what's especially that's going to be most valuable to this audience as advertisers? So you both have such a wealth of experience. I'd rather just get to the magic. So
okay.
We'll start with you this time, Elena.
Thanks. One thing that I would love for people to be a little bit more clear-eyed about is, what is AI technology good at doing? And this is, again, fundamentally a property of the technical architecture and the way these systems are set up. What is it really good at doing, and what is it not very good at doing? AI is fundamentally, at its core, a prediction machine. It is great at doing predictions, especially when you have very clearly labeled data and a ton of it. So, for example, one of the flagship operations of AI at MasterCard is fraud detection. If one of you loses your credit card here and someone picks it up and takes it to New Jersey to a gas station, 99.9999% chance that's going to get detected immediately. You're not going to lose any money. The bank's not going to lose any money. You're going to get a new card in 3 days. And that's because there's a ton of great, highly curated, well-labeled data about what is fraud, what is not fraud, what are you tending to do with your purchases and not, right? Great at doing predictions for that wealth of data that's clearly labeled. and then predicting outputs. So again, if you're a business, and one of the big use cases of AI over the last 10 years, if you have a lot of labeled data about your operations or about things you want to do analytics on, AI is actually very good at predicting next outcomes when you have that curated set. And that has to be done with thoughtful data science, thoughtful question curation, and really putting together a problem statement for that system to solve. Gen AI systems fundamentally do the same thing. They are prediction machines. They're predicting what type of image you want, pixel by pixel. They're predicting the text output based on text. But those text outputs are not generated, they're not angled toward truth. They're generated toward prediction. So what Gen AI actually cannot do very well at all is any exact reasoning task. There are several papers that John and I were talking about before this discussion that show Gen AI cannot multiply numbers, and they're very large numbers, like 10-digit numbers times another 10-digit number. Gen AI can't do this. The accuracy goes down to 0, which if you had a calculator or if you knew what multiplication was, you should be able to do that. There's a paper from Apple Research called Illusions of Thinking about the Tower of Hanoi puzzle. I don't know if anyone knows it. It's like you're moving blocks between different rings. And it's an exact reasoning task. Theoretically, if you know how to solve it with like 3 blocks, you could solve it for 100 if you actually knew what was happening. Again, Gen AI really fails at doing this at any type of scale. So it's making a prediction about an output. It's not actually telling you something that's true. That's not really the thing that it's oriented toward. But again, Gen AI can do a ton of great stuff. One of the things I think it's really good at, for example, is semantic search. So if you have a lot of documents that you want to search, you can now use natural language where before you had to do something programmatic. So you could say to a Gen AI system, hey, can you look through these 300 documents I have? I have 300 legal cases. I'm looking for anything that might pertain to this jurisdiction. Can you help me out with that? And instead of just doing a Control F for specific words, that Gen AI system can go and say, okay, here's what I found that kind of matches that. Here are your documents. But again, fundamentally a prediction-based machine. It can do a lot of great stuff. You have to understand what it's going to be good at doing and what it's not going to be good at doing to formulate a good business proposal. Again, this is about, if you just want to talk about good business, what is it going to be good at doing, what is it not going to be good at doing, and what problems can it help me solve versus what problems can it not help me solve. It's not a panacea. So that's my spiel on what I think everyone should know.
A fine spiel.
Yes.
That was a great spiel. Just as to carry on that point, Elena, if you combine a data scientist with a behavioral scientist, you've just exponentially increased how you look at ethics and AI and the processing behind it. So something to keep in mind. The question for me is, given my background as an operational psychologist and a forensic psychologist, is how do we mitigate, we know it's in our best interest to act ethically in every profession, not just advertising. How do we mitigate the impact of those who intentionally choose not to be ethical, not to behave ethically? That's been my world for 20 years. How do we counter the impact? Because we know that that exists. We all, in every profession. How do we mitigate that? And there are ways to mitigate that, specifically going to go back to that implicit or cognitive bias kind of perspective. We can use strategies and build them into AI systems that exclude those kinds of influence tactics or manipulation tactics. The influence inoculation that I mentioned, very simple, I'll explain it. It's a psychology construct that basically negates that impact on your cognition from a bias. So if there's a nudge present or an influence principle, such as social proof or liking or reciprocity, that is going to tap into your cognition. Influence inoculation negates the impact of that on your cognition, and it does it in the same implicit way. So it kind of levels the playing field for your decision making. So I'll give you an example. Very simple construct. It works like the greatest analogy is like a flu vaccine. Get a flu vaccine. Back in the day, it was introducing a bit of the virus in your system to then build your resilience to then fight off greater exposure of that virus. Influence inoculation works the same way. Give you an example. Wrap your heads around. We're all familiar. Well, let me look. Yeah, I think we're all familiar and remember the Trident advertisement, right? 4 out of 5 dentists recommend Trident for their patients who chew gum. They were very specific about that. That's the authority principle, right? And so the influence inoculation is very simple. Call it out and identify it. So I'm going to call it the authority principle, and I'm going to say, because they're referencing experts, I have just inoculated this whole room. You're welcome. So what that does for you is that this is the great benefit of it. Number one, it's agnostic. It doesn't care if you buy Trident or not. It has no dog in that fight. It just negated that unconscious influence that was tricked upon you in that advertising gimmick. Now you're free to choose whatever gum, Trident, Bubblicious, whatever your favorite. It doesn't care what the decision you make is. It just negates that trick that was played upon you. The other benefit is it lasts for future influence or manipulation attempts to build your resilience for the future without your, no, it's just an unconscious process. With regard to AI, that can be built in. These are operationally defined psychological constructs, the scientific literature. There's, believe it or not, 5 decades of research supporting the efficacy of this process. So for 50 years, we've been studying this. We've operationally defined these influence strategies, these manipulation tactics, whether it's a nudge, whether it's a cognitive bias, whether it's an influence principle, they're defined. AI can find them, AI can define them, and AI can remove them from the results that are being presented to you. And wouldn't that be a great advertisement for an AI product to say, hey, we've pulled out all the explicit biases in here, so it's clean, if you will, or give it a influence integrity score to say there's limited or zero or nominal influence tactics in the results that you're getting. And if you got that, wouldn't you put it right at the top as a banner to say, hey, we've pulled out as much explicit or implicit bias as possible in these results? So that's the question I don't hear answered is, it's in everybody's best interest to act ethically. There are those who don't. And we can mitigate that.
I was raised in Boston, so I'll say that the two of you are both wicked smart, first of all. And thank you so much. I'll do my last point, and then we might have time for questions. First of all, Elena, I will say this with respect. I call myself a geek, and when other geeks are geeking with me, I say this a compliment. So but I'll say this for myself about how I tend to frame Gen AI, is there's a term called narrow AI, which deep learning and other types of AI, in my experience, are a lot easier to test. Whereas most Gen AI, at least off-the-shelf tools, are when brands use wrappers from a ChatGPT or Anthropic. It is a large language model, hence the name. So what I usually, if this distinction makes sense, I'd love to talk to you about this more, is analytics versus aggregation. So if you want to analyze and use a tool for analyzing, narrow AI, oftentimes like deep learning, can really be very useful. And the legal industry was using it for years before Gen AI came into play. The danger, and this is where I'll make 2 quick points. First of all is that I work in the field of sustainability, meaning environmental sustainability. I don't know if the other John's still here, but one thing, oh, there you are. One thing is to recognize that the nature of large language models, especially in what are now called hyperscale data centers that are coming more into play, and the cloud, and with the strain on things like streaming services, right? I can get intense sometimes. My wife says, she calls it putting her hand on my knee. You need to calm down, right? But it's very hard to be calm when studying water for me. And the past couple of years, there's just a sort of reality about water. I didn't know about it, so I'm kind of telling large language models in general, the computation logic is to pull in as much data as you can to source responses to prompts, where it's not narrow AI. So besides all the errors I can go into like sycophancy and hallucinations, etc., it simply means how the tools basically work is sort of like me saying, Andrew, do I have something on my face? And he's like, hold on. And he leaves for 10 minutes and gets 10,000 people to be like, no, right? You don't need those tools. Now, I also say this, and I'm saying it adamantly, we do need water. Water is more important than certain choices. And I bring this up more in the sense of opportunities for society, is to ask questions about what is the source of the power, literally and metaphorically, for what drives Gen AI. And hyperscale data centers, more and more, are being put in areas that are water scarce. Bessemer, Alabama, outside Birmingham, there's a new hyperscale data center 5 times the size of a super Walmart, which just means it's big. That area is already water scarce, and that facility is going to use 2 million gallons of water a day. Water is a finite resource. So I bring this up because ethics has a lot of levels, A, and then what I work in fields of what's called regenerative sustainability, or if you want to read a great business book along these lines, is a book called Net Positive by a guy who was the CEO of Unilever for 10 years. How business runs, but sustainability actually means the reality of how business will survive in the earth, working. One point. Then the second point, because I want to talk about IEEE, there's a standard we have that's going to be released soon. The number is 7012. Andrew and I are working to hopefully certify it. The nickname for it is My Terms. So if you know, when I wrote a book about personal data in 2014, most of trust online is built through consensus. You go online and you have to fill out cookies. When the GDPR came out, that changed a little. But basically, no interaction happens with any of your consumers or in B2B unless someone goes somewhere and clicks something that says, I agree to and consent. This is a legal term called a term of adhesion. You have to function in modernity. You have to click those buttons. 7012, by the way, the standard is like $100, so the pitch is not really about money, uses what's called contracts, and it gives individuals their own personal terms and conditions. Because the concept of AI agents is actually not about the individual having agency at all. And here's one of the biggest opportunities, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to speak today, and thank you again, Andrew, is that the advertising industry, I still have so many friends who I worked with who are at Porter Novelli and Omnicom, et cetera. The biggest opportunity to work with customers is to say, hold on a second, the AI agents that are sourcing your data and using all these things, great, and consent, we have to exist there, but what are your terms and conditions? This becomes an opportunity for advertisers to say, because my final point, trust doesn't happen in isolation. Trust happens with an action, and you give someone the opportunity to respond to that action. It is only when that action happens that trust can even exist. So when people talk about trusted AI and they've just released something, it's not a misnomer per se, but it is something that doesn't allow the individual to say, well, hold on a second, I don't even understand what you're talking about. Advertisers are the communicators that we need desperately in this modern world of Gen AI to tell people, hold on a second, what do you think? And here's a contractual way. This is just one example of what we're doing. Tim Berners-Lee is building something similar, that we want to interact with you directly. Saves a lot of money in the same frame. Anyway, I don't know if we have time for questions, but thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.